In 2022, a genetic test confirmed what no one was supposed to find. High in the mountain valleys of Yellowstone, grazing among the most protected herd on the continent, lived something that shouldn't exist. Not according to more than a century of scientific consensus. Not according to the conservation strategies that had defined an entire field. But it was there, woven into their very DNA, waiting quietly for someone to finally look close enough to notice. Welcome to Infinite Findings, where we uncover the stories that reshape how we understand the natural world. Today, we're investigating one of the most stunning reversals in modern biology, a mystery that began with a routine genetic examination and ended with science completely rewriting the history of American wildlife recovery. The story starts with a contradiction. For over 100 years, Yellowstone's bison were celebrated as something almost sacred. The last untouched bloodline. The closest thing left to a living fossil of what the species had been before catastrophe. Scientists had assigned them a number that became legendary in conservation circles, 99.7% pure. A figure so precise, so carefully maintained, that it became the foundation for decades of research, funding decisions, and protection strategies. The crown jewel of North American conservation, the gold standard against which every other population was measured, and nobody thought to question it. Until James Derr, a geneticist working with the latest sequencing technology, decided to run a comprehensive genome analysis on those exact animals. It should have been routine, expected to confirm what everyone already knew. Instead, what the data revealed had nothing whatsoever to do with bison purity at all. Something was hiding in their bloodline, something that, by every conventional understanding of the species, absolutely should not have been there. The discovery didn't just challenge a single statistic. It shattered the entire foundation of how an entire scientific discipline had organized itself around a fundamental assumption. And to understand why that revelation landed so hard, we need to travel back to a moment when the American landscape was almost unrecognizable from what exists today. The year is 1873. Across the Great Plains, a living ocean of animals stretches beyond what any human eye can see. Between 30 and 60 million bison once moved across this continent like a force of nature, their hooves reshaping soil, their grazing patterns determining which plants flourished and which disappeared entirely. Nations built themselves around these herds. Economies, spiritual traditions, entire ways of life depended on their abundance. The bison wasn't simply part of that world, it was the world. Then, within the span of a single generation, almost all of it vanished. The collapse happened with stunning speed. Commercial hunting operations stripped hides by the millions. Railroad passengers leaned from train windows to shoot animals for entertainment, abandoning carcasses across prairies where they would rot in the sun. But underneath this chaotic slaughter ran something far colder and far more calculated. Military commanders understood a simple strategic truth: destroy the herds, and the Plains nations would have nothing to sustain them. So the killing wasn't always accidental. Sometimes it was actively encouraged by the very people who held power. By the 1880s, the numbers had become almost impossible to comprehend. From tens of millions down to 541 animals, 541 documented bison remaining in the entire United States. Biologists have a term for what happens when a species experiences such catastrophic collapse, a genetic bottleneck. An extinction event so severe that the surviving population gets squeezed down through an impossibly narrow window, carrying forward only whatever genetic traits happen to survive within those few hundred animals. Everything else is simply erased. Forever. Every single bison alive today, roughly 500,000 animals across the continent, traces directly back to those survivors. Which means every genetic possibility available to the species now exists only because it was present in that handful of animals that managed to escape the slaughter. High in Yellowstone's mountain valleys, the most isolated survivors found refuge in a landscape that had never been fully domesticated. A place where wild bison had grazed continuously for generations without being fenced, removed, or managed by human hands. Or so the story went. Even there, though, danger found them. By 1902, poachers were slipping into remote areas to hunt the last remaining animals, targeting them specifically for their heads, which collectors would pay more for than most working men earned in an entire year. When park officials finally counted what remained, the number shocked them. Roughly 23 animals, so few they could fit inside a single fenced pasture. The situation was dire for reasons that cut in multiple directions. A population that small faced extinction from hunting pressure, yes. But it faced something equally devastating from within, the slow genetic collapse that follows when animals have no choice but to breed among their closest relatives for generation after generation. The solution seemed straightforward. Bring in new animals from elsewhere. Rebuild the Yellowstone herd using bison that could revitalize the bloodline. The problem was finding bison to bring in. The continent had almost none left. But one man had seen the catastrophe coming years before anyone else had taken it seriously. In 1886, a Smithsonian taxidermist named William Temple Hornaday had traveled west to collect bison specimens for the museum, operating on the grim assumption the species would soon be completely extinct. What he discovered horrified him. The great herds he had come to document were already nearly gone. The experience changed him entirely. He came home determined to save the living animals rather than merely preserve their remains. Hornaday spent the rest of his career fighting for bison recovery. In 1905, he helped establish the American Bison Society and convinced a sitting president, Theodore Roosevelt, to join as its honorary leader. That connection mattered. In 1908, Roosevelt established the National Bison Range on tribal land in Montana. The warnings had reached all the way to the top of the American government. The following year, Roosevelt pushed further. The Bronx Zoo shipped 15 of its captive-bred bison by railroad to the newly established Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. It was one of the first times in history that captive animals were deliberately used to seed a wild population rather than the other way around. But no matter how much political will existed in Washington, the simple truth remained. There weren't enough animals anywhere to rebuild every depleted herd. The government had nowhere else to turn, which meant they had to reach out to a group of people that almost no history book has bothered to mention. The actual rescue of the American bison didn't originate in Washington. It didn't come from scientific societies. It wasn't orchestrated by presidents or government agencies. The most essential recovery work came from Native American and frontier families who had quietly been doing this work on their own, years before anyone in power even realized there was a crisis. In 1873, a man known to history as Walking Coyote accomplished something remarkable. He crossed the Continental Divide, carrying a small group of orphaned bison calves, young animals whose mothers had been killed in a hunt. He brought somewhere between 4 and 7 calves to the Flathead Valley and raised them there, caring for them as carefully as if they had been his own. By 1884, that small starting population had grown to roughly 13 animals. Walking Coyote made the decision to sell the herd to 2 ranchers named Michel Pablo and Charles Allard, who released the bison across the Flathead Reservation, where they could roam freely across roughly 50 square miles of open grassland. But the story gets more complicated from there. In 1893, Pablo and Allard made a purchasing decision that would ripple forward across more than a century. They bought dozens of additional bison from a rancher named Buffalo Jones. That purchase of roughly 44 animals included something crucial. 18 of those animals were documented cattle-bison hybrids. 26 were considered purebred wild bison. The remaining animals represented something in between. Hold that detail carefully. It matters more than anyone realized. By 1896, the combined Pablo-Allard herd numbered close to 300 animals, almost certainly the largest collection of plains bison remaining in the entire United States. When Allard died that year, his share was divided among his heirs and sold to various private buyers. Pablo kept growing his own portion until it approached 700 head. As the reservation began opening to outside settlement, as the landscape around them transformed, Pablo faced an impossible decision. He couldn't keep the animals where they were. They had nowhere to go. So he did something that changed everything. He reached out to officials at Yellowstone and offered to sell them a substantial portion of his herd. In 1905, officials accepted. In 1906, Pablo sent 40 animals to the park. In 1907, he sent 18 more. In 1909, he sent additional animals. Each transfer brought not just the purebred lineages everyone celebrated, but also the genetic traces of those cattle hybridizations that had occurred decades earlier on the Flathead Reservation. Yellowstone's bison population grew. The park was saved from immediate extinction crisis. Conservation strategies were built. Scientific reputations were established. A century passed. The herd was studied, protected, isolated from contamination, held up as the ultimate success story. Nobody questioned whether the protection itself was based on incomplete information. Then came 2022 and James Derr's genetic results. The findings rocked the scientific community like an earthquake. The most celebrated, most protected, most revered bison herd on the continent carried cattle DNA in their bloodline. Not from recent crossbreeding, not from some contemporary mistake, but from hybridization events that had occurred over 100 years earlier, introduced during the very rescue operations that had saved the species from complete annihilation. The revelation created immediate tension within the conservation world. Some breeders dismissed the finding as too minimal to matter meaningfully. Others, deeply invested in the concept of genetic purity, felt genuinely shaken by the discovery. But a number of scientists began articulating a different perspective entirely. Geneticist Oliver Ryder cautioned against interpreting these results through the lens of purity at all, noting that purity itself is ultimately a human invention imposed on biological processes that are naturally messy and constantly recombining in the wild. Other researchers made similar arguments. Ryan Davis suggested that hybridization isn't evidence of failure or contamination. It's one of evolution's most fundamental tools. Throughout evolutionary history, across countless species, including humans themselves, genetic blending has been a driving force of survival and adaptation. Seen from that angle, what the genetic test had exposed wasn't contamination or failure. It was ancestry. It was a biological record of exactly how the species had survived the narrowest, most dangerous moment in its entire existence. The real question shifted. It was never about how pure these bison are. It was about what becomes possible now that this knowledge exists. For a full century, conservationists had poured enormous effort into keeping bison herds rigidly separated from one another, terrified that genetic mixing would spoil some pristine ideal that might never have existed in the first place. But if that ideal was never truly real, if genetic mixing had been essential to survival all along, then many of those protective barriers could finally start coming down. Herds that had been held strictly apart for generations could now be deliberately combined. Larger populations could be built. Genetic diversity could expand. Healthier, more resilient herds could emerge from strategic mixing rather than artificial isolation. And the change is already happening. In 2024, federal officials and Montana state authorities shortened the quarantine period for bull bison, leaving Yellowstone from roughly 18 months down to about 300 days. The process still operates carefully. Bison are captured, held, and tested repeatedly for brucellosis over weeks and months before being cleared to leave the park. Even after leaving, they spend another year in secondary quarantine on tribal land before joining permanent herds. But the barriers are loosening. The philosophy is shifting. It took nearly 2 decades of negotiation, planning, and careful pilot testing before this system was even approved. A reminder that even solutions everyone could eventually agree on take generations to build. In February of 2026, federal officials orchestrated what they described as the largest single bison transfer in the program's entire history. 213 animals traveled 470 miles from Yellowstone to the Fort Peck Reservation. There, the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes now manage nearly 1,000 bison across tens of thousands of acres of restored grassland. Robbie Magnan oversees the tribe's buffalo program. He hadn't grown up around bison. He has said he was 10 years old before seeing a live one at a zoo hundreds of miles from his home because the animals had been completely absent from Fort Peck for 2 full generations. Now he manages a herd nearly 1,000 strong on the same land his grandparents once knew only through stories and memory. He still describes the buffalo's return as something he never expected to witness in his own lifetime. One tribal leader spoke about the buffalo's return in terms of healing, not just for the species, but for the land itself and for the people living on it. For Plains nations, the buffalo has always represented everything at once: food, shelter, tools, and ceremony. The living center of a way of life that the original slaughter had been deliberately designed to destroy. This recovery work spans the entire country now. The Intertribal Buffalo Council coordinates transfers across dozens of member tribes. Since the program began, more than 600 bison have been rehomed from Yellowstone to nearly 30 tribes across more than a dozen states and into Canada. The pace is accelerating. As the quarantine pipeline becomes more efficient, as more tribal facilities come online to receive animals, the transfers increase year after year. And for the first time in more than a generation, Yellowstone abandoned its long-standing population cap of 3,000 animals. The park now aims to let the herd range between 3,500 and 6,000. A deliberate choice to allow the population to grow rather than hold it artificially small based on an old fear that genetic evidence has now shown was never justified. Inside the park, something equally significant has occurred. The 2 ancestral lineages that scientists had tracked separately for over a century finally merged completely. The indigenous survivors and the animals brought in from outside populations are now grazing and breeding together as a single, unified herd. They're indistinguishable in the field, yet their genomes still carry the complete memory of where each thread originated. The history is no longer 2 separate stories. It's one. Which brings us back to where this mystery started. The purest wild bison on Earth, the crown jewel, 99.7% untouched. That claim was true and false simultaneously. And the narrow space between those 2 contradictions contains the entire story of the species. That faint trace of cattle DNA running through the Yellowstone bison reads less like a stain on their history and more like a fingerprint left behind by the rescue itself. It's proof that a few hundred surviving animals, together with a handful of stubborn, largely forgotten people who refused to let the species disappear, actually managed to drag an entire species back from the absolute edge of extinction. 23 original survivors, 21 animals brought in from outside, 1 genome that still remembers all of it. In 2016, more than a century after walking coyote first carried those orphaned calves across the continental divide, the United States formally recognized just how far this recovery had traveled. The government named the bison the country's official national mammal, a symbolic gesture, yes, but one that closed a circle stretching back over 100 years. From a shepherd boy's determination to a handful of orphaned calves, to a species that came within a few hundred animals of completely vanishing from the planet. If you found this story compelling, if you're curious about the moments where science rewrites everything we thought we understood about America's natural world, subscribe to Infinite Findings and join us for our next investigation. And before you leave, settle this in the comments for us. If purity was never really the point, should any single population still be considered more valuable than another? Or does every surviving lineage deserve exactly equal protection? Let us know your thoughts, and we'll see you on the next discovery.